In this DRAS demo, I'm going to demonstrate how to add a new service, some service states, and a job that will allow us to switch the service between different states. So to start off with, I'm going to log in as an administrator, and I'm going to start off by creating a specific group and user. So we're going to delegate the task of switching a service to a specific user. So the first thing I want to do is create a new group. We can see we've got some groups already created here. Now what we're going to do is create a service for Exchange. So this particular service is going to be delegated to the Exchange administrator. Now permissions can be set at the group level or individual users. It's preferable to use groups wherever possible, just makes user permission management a bit easier. So what we're going to do is create a group called mail group. There's no users at the moment. Okay. Let's create a user, give him his password. At the moment password authentication is done locally, but we will be looking to implement external password authentication with Active Directory and other authentication mechanisms. You can specify whether the user is an admin user or whether their account is currently locked. Also we can assign the group, so let's just add in the group that we just created, and the permissions we'll leave empty at the moment but that will get populated once we've defined our service and our job. So we've now got a user and a group that we can assign. So what we're going to need to do is define the actual services that we want to switch. Now if we look at Infoblox, what we've got is a couple of host objects here already defined in this domain apps.company.com. So what we're going to get DRAS to do is create a CNAME that will switch between these two host objects depending on where the service is actually running. So it's either Docklands or Slough data centers. So if we just go back to DRAS, we're going to add a new service, and we can give this whatever we want. So we can call this, for instance, Exchange Mail Service. Fully qualified domain name, so this will be the name of the CNAME or the alias. So in this case I'm just going to call it mail.company.com. Leave the TTL blank, it will just inherit whatever's set at the default. The DNS environment is used to specify the environment for this particular DNS setting, this DNS record. So for instance you could have an external environment or an internal environment, a lab. There could be different IPAM systems in use. You can see here we've got several for Bluecat, Infoblox, Microsoft. If I just go to add new environment, I'll show you the sort of settings that we've got. So for instance we can support just standard dynamic DNS, and what we do there is we specify the target DNS servers, so we can add multiple DNS servers, and that's where the dynamic updates will get sent. We can also put in timeouts and retries, and when this is filled in there's also a test button. We also support Infoblox, so with Infoblox we do it via the API, so we will require the IP address of the gridmaster or the gridmaster candidate if you've got one, and you can tell the system to use the gridmaster candidate if the gridmaster is unavailable. We've also got a timeout and also a dedicated user account that is created in Infoblox that we use, so it's kind of like a service account. And finally, if we use Infoblox we can also specify the DNS view that we actually use for this particular record. Now what I'm going to do is use an environment that's already prepared, so in this case it's called IB Internal Network. For this type of service we can also specify whether we're going to create an A record or just create a host record. So we're going to use an alias, and if we look at the states page, what basically happens here is it'll ask us to put in the FQDN of the actual host object. If we set the record type to a record, then under states it asks us for an IP address. So this will actually create an A record in DNS pointing to that IP address. But I prefer to use CNAMEs. Okay. Now I need to specify a couple of states. These are the states that are already defined in the system. So this would represent, for instance, your data center environment, or we can add some new ones directly from this page if we want to. So I'm going to create one called Slough Data Center. Okay, we can also specify a color. So there's some colors here you can use, or you can just click in here and you get the dropper. So for instance, if you say that Slough is your primary data center, you might want to make that green. Okay, and then we need to put in the FQDN of the host object. So in this case it's sloex01 in apps.company.com. Okay, so that's the first host object. Let's add the next one. So again, I'm going to add a new state, and this one is going to be Docklands Data Center. And if this is our backup data center, you might want to make it sort of a red color, so you can see straight away that it's in DR mode. exch01.apps.com. So we just check Infoblox. So what this is going to do is, when we switch a service, it's going to create an alias called mail.company.com, and depending on the state, it's either going to point to Slough exch01 or doc exch01. Okay. Now, if you've currently got an alias, you can tell the system where it's currently pointing at the moment. So there's not actually, doesn't exist at the moment. There's no CNAME for mail. You can see it's empty, so it doesn't exist. But so we're just going to say do not set current state. But if it did already exist, then you could tell it which one it's currently using. Now we've got the option to add users and groups to this particular service. So if we specify our group, and then by default the user will get view access to this group, but we can also specify, whether they can edit the service or whether they can delete it or whether they can switch it. So we'll allow them to switch this particular service but do nothing else. Okay, so let's add. So there's our Exchange mail service currently set up. Okay, so these are the states that we've got, the FQDNs. Now what we're going to need to do is, before we can do anything with it, we're going to need to create a job to allow us to switch this service. In fact, we'll need to create two jobs for each of the data centers. So what we can do is it populates it for us already, but we can just put in on the end here to Slough. Okay. Now if it's an ad hoc job and you just want to run it once, you can leave this box ticked. If it's actually part of a DR plan, you might want to leave this job open so that it's always going to be available. I don't want to run this job immediately, and we'll run it later. Go on to the next screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch the mail service to Slough. So what I need to do is specify the state that I defined earlier. You can have multiple services in this job, but for this particular example we're just going to have one service. Finally, we've got permissions. So if we select our mail group, now by default that group will get view access, But what we can do again, we can specify whether the user is able to edit or delete the job. But what we actually want them to do is just be able to run it. If it is a service, if it is a job that contains multiple services, it's possible it could take a little while to run. So in that case, you can also give them the stop permission, so they can stop a job whilst it's currently running. That will obviously leave the services in a bit of an indeterminate state. If it's already switched some services and you stop it halfway through, then some services won't get switched. So we would suggest using that with caution. So let's just create that job. Okay, that's good. Now what we can do, if we just go up to the jobs page, we can actually clone this to create the other job so that we can switch it to Docklands. So let's obtain that to dock, and then we just need to modify the state. So it's going to be Docklands. There we go. If we look at the permissions, because we cloned it, it's inherited the permissions. Right, so there's our two jobs. Now I'm logged in as admin at the moment, so I can see everything. But what we really need to do is log in as the mail administrator, and then the permissions should kick in. So let's log in as mailman. Okay, so I'm getting the dashboard. All you can see here just the jobs I've got access to. If we go to services, I can only see the Exchange mail service. There's the two states and there's the two jobs. If I go to the jobs page, I can only see those two jobs. So you can see this is really where the power comes in. You can delegate the administration of the switching of specific services to specific individuals. So if we want to actually activate one of these now, so let's click on the job and then let's run it. I won't create, I can put in a change reference if I want to. In fact, just for compliance purposes, let's do that. There we go. Let's just run that job. Okay, there we go. So that's basically now would have created a CNAME pointing to the Slough data center. If we go back into Infoblox and just refresh, there you can see straight away we've got a record now that points to the Slough Exchange server. And I can check that in DNS by just looking at the alias. So if I look up mail.company.com, there we go. So mail.company.com points to the Slough Exchange server. So to demonstrate this switching back, if we want to switch it now to Docklands, I can just run this job. You can see it's currently running in Slough and it's going to be running in Docklands. Run the job. Again, put in the change request number if you want to. Run. Okay, so the switch is complete. If I go back and do my DNS query again, you can see now the alias has changed to Docklands and the IP address has changed, whereas before it was in Slough. And if we go back and look at Infoblox and just refresh the record, you can see the alias changed from Slough to Docklands. You also get a job log, so any errors that occur will appear on here and you've got a complete history. And another great feature, for documentation purposes, what you can do is actually copy this link into a document, so that if you want to create a procedure to explain to people how to switch services between different states, you can literally just cut and paste these links into the document. In a Word document, for instance, they'll then be able to click on that link, they'll get challenged for their username and password, and it will take them directly to the job page, which they can then just run.